Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Whip Union, and in this one, the Russians have managed to advance south of Sudzha as fighting continues within Cherkasskaya Konopelka. The Russians also managed to advance east of Kupiansk to the southeast of Kupiansk direction of Borova. The Russians advanced alongside the Selydove River line further down south and east of Yampolivka. The Russians advanced in the western flank of Toretsk, in the northern flank of Kurakhove, as well as closing the pocket west of Kurakhove, eliminating the Ukrainian pocket within the area, where reports suggest that some gave up and some did not. The Russian forces advanced northwest of Velikonovosilka, storming the fortified position in the area northwest of the town. Starting out in the Sudzha direction, the Russians managed to gain control over the road leading up from Ulanok towards Cherkasskaya Konopelka. With this, the Russians have regained control over the road connecting the two towns, and the Russian forces operating within there now have a solid road to drive through to resupply their forces, and at the same time will allow the Russians to launch stronger offensive operations to regain control over the town here in the southern flank of Sudzha. This is while the Russians have regained control over Selydove and the western flank of Sudzha, and the Russian forces are now just somewhere between 18 and 20 kilometers from allowing the tips to touch between the northern and southern flank of Sudzha, where the majority of the road is approximately 8 kilometers through open roads, and in the southern flank about 2 kilometers through open roads, making about half in open roads and half going through Sudzha itself between the eastern and western flanks connecting. However, there's also the aspect that we have to consider, that is the southern flank of Sudzha, where if the Ukrainians do not have a strong enough defense to the south of the town, the Russians can bypass the town in its entirety and connect through the open fields, gaining control of the forest lines and forest patches, to simply sending guerrilla fighters to fight and hit the Ukrainian supply lines would be enough to significantly affect the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. But gaining full control over the area between Sudzha and the border area could completely encircle the Ukrainian forces within the Kursk region. Moving on to the Kupiansk direction, the Russians managed to advance to the north of Ivanivka, gain control over some forest lines. The Russians are here slowly advancing towards Kupiansk from the eastern direction, where there has been no movement since the Russian capture of Kislivka and the fortified areas to the west of the town. The Russians have yet to enter Stepovo-Novoselivka or gain control over further fortified positions in the area, as their focus has been in the Sinkivka direction and the Oskil River line bridgehead across. This has allowed the Russians to significantly expand their zone of control north of Kupiansk, but within the pocket itself, it has been fairly silent, besides some Ukrainian counterattack to regain control over Kruslinikivka, or parts of them, and Zaporizhzhia. To the south of Losova, the Russians are slowly advancing west of the fortified positions as they move towards the first line of defense around Borova from the eastern direction, following the Ukrainian recapture of Zaporizhzhia. In the direction of the Selydove River line, the Russians have managed to advance to gain full control over the outskirts of Yampolivka, thereby gaining full control over the town, as well as they have started attacking alongside the forest patches to the east and forest lines to the south. The objective of the Russians here is to squeeze the Ukrainian forces out of the forest patch areas, where the objective is to strike them as they withdraw from them, and therefore they are attacking the flanks often to force the Ukrainians to withdraw, otherwise would be encircled, and then at the same time to have direct fire control over the escape route, as the only area with cover that the Ukrainians can withdraw to is through the forest lines going through the forest patch areas and then out towards Toretsk and Zaporizhzhia to the south. This means that the Ukrainians now are operationally encircled, and they risk complete encirclement whichever they have of forces in the forest patch area east of Yampolivka. Gaining full control over this area will allow the Russians to start storming Toretsk and Zaporizhzhia from the north. Combining that with an assault from the east could allow them to have much more success than previous attempts, and allow the Russians to simultaneously expand their zone of control west of the Selydove River line towards Kolidyasi and Smyrna across the river line itself, and this will allow them to gain further control over the fortified areas. And this expansion of their control could allow the Russians to combine an assault on Zaporizhzhia from the western and eastern banks of the river line, and it will also allow the Russians to generally increase the strength of their forces on the western bank. We see that the Russians continue offensive operations here near the Selydove River line at the same time as they do it near the Oskil River line in 2 separate offensive operations, and pressure on Borova is also increasing. Therefore, we see that the Oskil River line really has 3 separate offensive operations: the Kupiansk front, the Borova front, and the Lyman front, all happening simultaneously. To the west of Toretsk, the Russians continued offensive operations alongside the towns of Novospassky and Shcherbinivka. The Russians almost have full control over Shcherbinivka, and at the same time they're now pushing through Novospassky. They will likely see increased offensive operations by the Russians along the fortified positions to the west of Lyman and Novospassky, gaining control over the fortified positions and the high ground in the area as they advance further in the northern direction, as they need to consolidate their gains if they want to keep them long term. To the southwest, the Russians also continued offensive operations near Kurakhove, where the Kurakhove front has now ended as the pocket west of Dashne has been closed. The Russians have gained full control over the fortified area and the area in between Dashne and Ulakli. They are also advancing further within Ulakli. The remaining Ukrainian forces within the town are now cut off from Konstantinopel, and the Russians have also stormed Konstantinopel, gaining control over a foothold in the eastern parts and reaching all the way to the western outskirts of the town to cut off the road out of Konstantinopel. The Russians also expanded north of Andrivka following the capture of the fortified positions in the area, where their objective with moving in the northern direction is to cut off the Ukrainian forces alongside the main highway area by connecting their forces between Shripne and Andrivka. This will also allow them to force the Ukrainians to withdraw from the area and back towards the towns there, where they will be caught out in the open as there's no towns or fortified positions between the areas in the east and all the way towards Bohdanivka or Oleksivka. Therefore, the Russians are really aiming to catch the Ukrainians off guard and exposed out in the open, as they want to connect the northern and southern directions and strengthen the cooperation between the forces near the northern direction and the southern flank, as Russians are looking to gain control of the remaining fortified positions west of Andrivka and then move onwards towards Oleksivka. At the same time, with the fighting reaching Konstantinopel and the Russians storming it and gaining a foothold within it, it's only a matter of time before the Russians gain control of that as well. And if they combine it with their attack in the north to gain control over the area between Andrivka and Konstantinopel, the Russians will have significantly strengthened their positions in the area, and with the road open from Kurakhove towards Konstantinopel, we can see additional offensive operations towards Bahatir, Ruslev, and onwards to the border area between the Donetsk region and the Dnipropetrovsk region. At the same time, the Russians have also managed to advance northwest of Velika Novosilka, gaining control over the first fortified positions in the area and storming through the forest lines to push the Ukrainians out of their fortified positions and backwards towards Burilatsky, Vilnepolye, and Novocheretsovate. The Russians continued offensive operations northwest of Velika Novosilka, west of Kurakhove, and towards Pokrovsk, in between Pokrovsk and Kurakhove, as they aim to gain control over the border area between Pokrovsk in the north to Velika Novosilka in the south and the Zaporizhzhia region. That is it for the frontline changes, although there's a very interesting development that happened today, and that is the first talks between the United States and Russia in official talks with regards to negotiations, since the initial negotiations fell apart in the fall of 2022. And now we see that the US delegation, Russian delegation met in Saudi Arabia. They talked for 4.5 hours. According to the Russian side, the negotiations went, quote, not badly, and there was a serious conversation on all issues. The parties agreed to advance bilateral relations and respect each other's interests. It is difficult to say yet that the positions of Russia and the United States are converging. It is unlikely that Putin and Trump will meet soon. However, once there are more developments in these relationships and the peace treaty, then there could be arranged a meeting between the two. Individual teams of Russian and US negotiators will begin contacts on Ukraine in due course, and the talks were positive, said second Russian negotiator Kirill Dmitriev. The parties discussed the fact that two great countries cannot help but communicate with each other. Practically, they need to communicate to avoid escalation. According to Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, the Russians and the United States have agreed to cooperate on economic opportunities that could emerge after a settlement in Ukraine. They also agreed to establish a consultation mechanism to address irritants in the US-Russian relation. So the areas where they have issues, they can cooperate and find an agreement. Finally, they agreed on a 3-stage peace plan, including a ceasefire, elections in Ukraine, and then signing a final agreement, a peace deal. This is very interesting because it shows that the United States wants a peaceful outcome for Ukraine. They want the war to end, but they also do not care if it's Zelensky ruling Ukraine or someone else. This is an issue for Ukraine and not an issue for Russia, because Russia has already been raising doubts about the legitimacy of Ukraine and Zelensky as the president of Ukraine, because his term ran out despite martial law prohibiting elections in Ukraine. At the same time, Zelensky's term has also ended, so there's this clash here as to whether Zelensky is legitimate or not, according to the Russians. And this has made it so that Russia denies negotiating a peace deal with Ukraine unless a new election is held in Ukraine. And this is a very interesting way to go about this, because what it really means is that they're buying time. Because whether Zelensky signs it or someone else signs it doesn't really matter. Maybe it does from a legal term, and that is actually why they do it. But I doubt that that is the case, because in the end, it really matters who is recognized as the leader of Ukraine, and who is currently recognized is Zelensky. Regardless of the legal talk, it is a way to buy time, because if a ceasefire happens and elections happen, that will be a long enough time for the Russians to take advantage of a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, and it could allow the Russians to gain some sort of benefit in this time, because whether it is fighting or peace, the Russians are growing militarily at a faster pace than the Ukrainians. However, it is not fast enough to create a large reserve. Instead, if a ceasefire is signed, the Russians will be able to grow at an even faster rate, and the numbers will simply be so staggering in comparison to the Ukrainian forces that the Russians can create an entire different grouping. An example is if the Russians had 150,000 troops against Ukrainian 100,000 troops, and the Ukrainians grew by 5,000 a month, and the Russians grew by 10,000 a month. Then it would take the Russians 5 months to reach 200k, and at that time, the Ukrainians would be at 125. That is naturally a much faster rate for the Russians to grow in, but if we compare this to an example, a ceasefire, at that point, the Russians would maybe take 2 months to reach 210k, because at that point, they'll be growing at 30k a month instead of 10,000 a month. Potentially even 300k within the 5 months. In comparison, the Ukrainians would similarly grow by around 15 to 20,000 a month, and then they would be at 150 to 175 within 5 months. And we see here that the growth of the Russian forces is staggering in comparison to the Ukrainians. While the Russians would have grown by 150,000, doubling their forces in Ukraine, the Ukrainians would only have grown by 75,000, increasing by 75%. But at the same time, the difference between the Russian and Ukrainian forces went from 50,000 to 125,000, and it gives the Russians a lot more opportunities for local advantages near the front line. So the Russians have an interest in reducing their own casualties, even if it reduces the Ukrainian casualties as well, because their growth is simply incomparable to the Ukrainian growth. In the end, this is all speculation. We don't know how the negotiations will go. There is definitely potential in this for a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. I am hopeful, but not optimistic with regards to it. In the end, it is a peace deal that both Russia and Ukraine will be satisfied with, that needs to be reached, and the United States and Europe is completely out of the picture with regards to whether a deal can be signed between Russia and Ukraine. Because although Ukraine wants some security guarantees and so on, the West will give these regardless of what Ukraine does. However, in the end, who needs to agree is Ukraine and Russia. If Ukraine and Russia agree on something and Europe and the West does not agree, then that does not matter because Russia and Ukraine can make the deal with each other outside of Europe and the West as a whole. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.